Jesus calls to us, saying, "Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Because David enjoyed hiking in the White Mountains, it is appropriate that we turn to the words of the psalmist as we draw near to God this morning. Please join me in the responsive call to worship. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Our help comes from the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps us will never slumber nor sleep. The Lord will keep you from all evil. As you all know, David found such joy when working in his garden. So as we gather this day to say our sacred goodbyes, it is appropriate that we begin by singing together the great hymn of faith, "In the Garden." I invite you to stand as you are able.
Please be seated. Please join me in the unison prayer of invocation. Eternal God, you are the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all things. From you we receive the precious gift of life, and it is to you that we return when our earthly labors are done. We gather this day remembering the promises of our Lord, who said, "I will not leave you comfortless." Come to us now, everlasting God, in the power of your holy love. In the silence of these moments, speak to us of eternal things, and grant us the assurance of the life with you that shall be everlasting. This we ask in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who taught us to pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Here again, the wisdom of God as we find it in the book of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to be born and a time to die. Today is a time to grieve, but it is also a time to give thanks for all of the special moments that we shared with David over the years. I will remember a soft-spoken man with a brilliant mind who worked on the Apollo space program. I will also remember walking through his garden at the house here in town and, of course, all of the rose bushes. I also remember one hot summer day when he came down with Betty and a rototiller to prepare an area of the church grounds for a garden that was going to be planted by the children in the Sunday school that summer. Yes, there are many memories, and the memories that are good will be forever etched upon your hearts. It is that reality that led John Lovejoy Elliott to write these words. The love of the human heart is the most real and the most beautiful of all of the realities we know. It is the richest gift of our manhood and our womanhood. It is the love that joins us together as husband and wife, father and mother, parent and child, brother, sister, friends and neighbors. Whatever the length of time may have been, to have known something of this is to have experienced the supreme privilege of being human. The anguish of parting cannot destroy this most real of all realities. The love has been, the affection has existed, the ties have been woven. Life has been shared, the joys and the sorrows. This has been as real and as strong as anything in life. The love that one has borne can never die, for it has become a part of us, of our lives, woven into the very fabric of our being. Each of us would wish to leave some part of ourselves, some memory, some influence for good. So here and now we bear witness to the one we knew in life, who now in death bequeaths a subtle part, precious and beloved, which will be with us in truth and beauty, in dignity, courage, and love, to the end of our days. At this time, I would like to invite David's family to share a few words.
I'm sorry. All right, well, most of you out there already know me. I'm Laura Bollier. I was David's favorite and only daughter. I want to thank everybody sincerely for coming out today to celebrate my father's beautiful life. I'm humbled by all the heartfelt messages many of you have sent out over the past few days, and I want to let you know that it really just kept us going. Although today is going to be an extremely hard day, I want to take this time to remember and honor special memories that I had with my father. My father was born and raised in Massachusetts, Stoneham to be exact. He grew up right by Hago Harrington's, or as he used to call it, Hugo Harrington's. How it's pronounced is still up for debate. It's a mini golf place, and it was named for an American hockey player who played for the Bruins and Montreal Canadiens between 1925 and 1933. He loved playing mini golf and would go a lot as a child. This, of course, ended up being the obvious place to take me mini golfing when I was a child. A bonus was that there was a Brigham's right across the street. After a heated game of mini golf, he always let me win. He would take me out for ice cream. He would order his signature dish of coffee ice cream topped with pineapple and marshmallow fluff, and we would take a stroll through his old neighborhood on Governor Road. It was on these strolls that he would tell me stories of his childhood. One of my favorite stories was about his beloved dog, Duke. Duke was a Scottish terrier with an attitude who passionately believed he was bigger than he was. One day my father was helping his father fix the roof. Duke was down in the yard playing when he started furiously barking at a Great Dane strolling down the road. My father, seeing how much bigger the other dog was than Duke, tried to scramble down the ladder to bring Duke in the house. But alas, he was too slow. He watched in horror as the Great Dane picked Duke up in his mouth and shook him. Then he carefully placed Duke back down and continued on strolling down the street. According to my dad, Duke was never the same after this incident, but learned to keep his distance when bigger dogs came around. My father was a great storyteller, and many of my childhood memories are simply of walks and visits with my father, where we would talk about things all past, present, and future. He was the man who taught me about outer space and various constellations. He taught me about the value of a dollar and not to spend that dollar, and that plaid pants would never go out of style. He loved science and math and would strive for us kids to be the best. Work hard and you shall succeed was always his motto, which is no surprise considering he earned several degrees from the very prestigious MIT. He was a brilliant man, and his legacy lives on through us and his grandchildren. In fact, I see flecks of my father's personality every day in my own children, Brady and Adeline. Like my dad, Brady finds something he loves and must know everything about it. In kindergarten, he loved the Titanic, so I found myself buying millions of books about the Titanic. He learned everything, right down to the proper number of smokestacks that were on the boat. If he saw a picture of the Titanic that didn't have the proper number of smokestacks on it, that illustrator better watch out because you can be sure our child would notice. Adeline is a bit different than Brady. While she does love learning, her mind and body are constantly in motion. She learns best by moving, which is a trait that she inherited from my father. My father loved the peace and quiet of the great outdoors and would produce some of his best ideas while hiking or the obvious gardening. One thing I can say for sure about both my children is that they both inherited my father's stubborn streak. Many of you who knew my father and mother knew their love for gardening ran deep. Both my parents were garden club members, and my father was part of the forestry committee. My father took extraordinary pride in his rose garden and was quick to offer up a bouquet of flowers to neighbors and friends. He also had a mean green thumb for sunflowers, which is why I'm wearing the dress I am today. When I was about 6 or 7, I remember his sunflowers grew so tall I could reach out my bedroom window and touch them. To this day, sunflowers are my favorite flower, with roses coming in a close second. As many of you know, my dad was diagnosed with dementia shortly after the death of my mother in 2014. While a tragic diagnosis for someone so brilliant, my family and I learned how to appreciate the small moments and the things dementia did not take. For instance, his sense of humor. On one of my visits Not so long ago, I wore my new running shoes. They were bright and colorful, totally a me-type shoe. I noticed my dad kept staring down at them. He was more of a white sneaker type of guy. So I said, "Hey, Dad, want a race?" And he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I would, but I wouldn't want to embarrass you." In that moment, a glimmer of himself came back to us, and it was the small moments like that that will forever warm my heart. In closing, we love you, Dad. We are grateful to have had you for as long as we did, and we will always miss you. But we are glad for your sake that your troubles are behind you. Give Mom a hug and a kiss for us, and tell her we miss her. Rest well, dearest Dad, and thank you for everything you did and everything you were. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. My family and I, we really appreciate it.
I didn't know what to say about my father. I went into his field and followed in his footsteps, but every time I tried to put something on paper, it just didn't feel right. So what I did was my sister picked a poem that I think is very fitting for me to read. The poem's titled "He's Gone" by David Harkins. He is gone. You can shed tears that he is gone, or you can smile because he has lived. You can close your eyes and pray that he'll come back, or you can open your eyes and see all that he's left. Your heart can be empty because you can't see him, or your heart can be full of love you shared. You can turn your back on tomorrow and live yesterday. Or you can be happy for tomorrow because of yesterday. You can remember him only that he is gone, or you can cherish his memory and let it live on. You can cry and close your mind, be empty and turn your back. Or you can do what he'd want. Smile, open your eyes, love and go on. The things I remember about my father the most is early on, and Jamie might have forgotten this one, is we used to go up camping, and there'd be several families. I believe, Marty, yours was one of them. We'd go up to a campground somewhere in New Hampshire. I forgot where it was. We'd all pitch tents. There was a little candy store down the lane, and we'd be dragged up any mountain that was around in that area, and we would be swimming in the lake. That was some of my favorite times. That and Lake Sunapee later on at the motel. Eventually, we did start vacationing down the Cape, and I remembered the change when we went from the mountains to the Cape. Dad told me he did it for my mom because my mom preferred the beach over the mountains. So our later teenage years were all spent there because my mom loved the beach. And we're also saying goodbye to her today as well. And we're putting her to rest with my father. And I just wanted to make sure she was mentioned. And I really miss them both. That's all I can do.
I'd like to expand on some of the things my siblings just mentioned. I'd like to give you a glimpse of my father through my own eyes, but hopefully sharing a personal perspective will give you an idea of the man who he was. But I think you have to start off with the accomplishments that the layperson knows him for, too. I remember being a young boy and saying, "Dad, what do you do?" And his answer was, "I'm a chemical engineer, Jamie." And it was at an age where I automatically assumed that he drove a train with giant tankers on it that would move chemicals throughout the country. And I later realized that, okay, engineering is a much different, it doesn't always apply to trains. So some of his education, we grew up valuing education in my household, much because of his accomplishments, and there were many teachers on his side of the family, and of course my mother was a teacher too. So he had a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from MIT, and he went on to get a Master's in Material Engineering. And then finally from MIT, he got a degree which he described to me as, at the time, MIT was the only university in the country that offered it, and it was a materials engineer degree. So my impression from his credentials is that he did excel in his field and was blessed with talents. He took chemistry graduate courses at Tufts, and he took business administration courses at Harvard, too. And I remember when I told him some of my graduate work was going to get funded through the school that I worked at, and he told me the best education is the one that someone else pays for. And given the state of college debt these days and how graduates are saddled with this, he was completely right, of course, too. Mentioned the heat shield about the Apollo, too, and I always kind of wondered about that. And at my mother's funeral, gentlemen from MIT would come through the line, and all of them would talk about the Apollo heat shield. It was an accomplishment. They shared with that, and I remember asking one of them, "Well, which Apollo?" Because there were many of them, as you know. And this gentleman said, "All of them." And so the work that they did on the heat shield applied to all of the Apollos. And later on, my brother informed me last night that he also worked on some of the heat shielding for the space shuttle, too, the tiles that we've always heard so much about, too. He had 7 patents, and I remember when he worked in Lexington for Kennecott Copper, and he never said this to me, but I always kind of felt it, that he felt like he was inventing things for other people, and it didn't sit right with him. And so his role at Kennecott Copper was to find new uses for the material copper. Eventually he went off on his own and started patenting his own inventions. And some of those inventions, which my brother could probably explain a lot better than I could, there were copper-filled conductive epoxies, basically glue that moved electricity in my definition. He had heating panels. There was something really cool called the flame-sprayed roofing material, which my brother's shaking his head. I have no idea, but it sounds really neat. His big one was the anti-fouling and anti-sliming coating material. This was something that he went to the mat for. He really had a lot of interest in this product. He was going to create a coating for ocean liners that would reduce drag. Barnacles wouldn't grow on these hulls, and seaweed wouldn't form on them, and that would save a lot of money in fuel costs, too. And to us, this was very normal, but looking back, it was very strange that we had a chemistry lab in our garage producing legal materials only, and this is where he generated samples to provide potential investors with. And we had a chemist in that garage, and the base of this material, of course, was copper. And this beautiful casket represents his love of everything involved in copper, too. But the base was a copper dust, and the whole garage was just coated with copper dust all the time. The chemist that worked for him became a family friend and worked with him outside of his private endeavors, too, and formed relationships with the family. But I remember he had samples in Buzzards Bay and in Florida to see if it would resist the growth of barnacles both in the north and the south in tropical waters and the waters here. And I remember doing trips with him to check the progress of these samples too. He did government work as well, and was actually very proud of his work. And unfortunately, it did involve developing weapons, and I remember hearing some documentaries on the development of the atomic bomb and the scientists that were involved in that at Los Alamos, and the ethical question that got put forth to these scientists afterwards when people came to him and said, how could you invent such a terrible weapon that would devastate so many lives? And the response from a lot of the scientists was, well, we didn't consider that. To us, it was science, and it was more about to see if it was possible, too. And I think my father shared that, and not in the development of things that would bring harm, but the possibilities of creating and building. Could these things be done? He had a lot of top secret clearances, too, which he couldn't help himself sometimes to talk about with us and share with us, these cool projects that the military would bring his company into and how he would contribute to that too. You know, and you would, in my household, you'd say something like, well, where's the VCR tape of Snow White? Oh, it's next to the tape on the trials of the cluster bomb from ABCO. And that was very average to us too. He also worked in developing the artificial heart, the Jarvik 7. And basically, at the time, this was an aluminum and a polyurethane device, and polyurethane was a specialty of my father. It was connected to a 400-pound air compressor that would accompany its first occupant, Dr. Barney Clark, for the rest of his life, all 112 days of it, too. And I remember that time in my life with my father following this very closely of how Dr. Barney Clark was managing too. And he was excited about the possibilities. And again, that science, the knowledge of what could be and how many people it would help. Very different from what I just spoke of. When I was a teenager, who would become the valedictorian in my class, who was a friend, she asked me one day, can I interview your father? And right away I was like, for what? was my answer. And I think that was the first time that I understood that he was a little different than most dads, too. Reverend Hughes mentioned about his love of the outdoors, and he shared that with us, too, particularly when my brother and I were younger, too. He loved camping, and if Dave didn't mention it, I was going to mention it. The eternal battle between the woods and the mountains and the freshwater versus saltwater and the beach. And there was a transition in our family. Dad got his way when we were young. Mom got her way later on, too. And my dad was very fair like that, always having a balance, too. But before that transition happened, I remember one weekend him taking myself and my brother to climb Mount Washington. Now, you've seen those bumper stickers of this car climbed Mount Washington. You should try walking up it. It's a lot harder. And for someone that's afraid of heights, it was pretty unnerving for me, too. So we drove up there, we camped out the night before, and then we tackled the mountain in the morning, too. And, you know, a fear of heights or anything like that, it didn't matter. It was, we're going this way, Jamie. And that's all there was to it. And unintentionally, such an attitude gives one strength. Fear of heights wasn't even a thought until I got to the most precarious areas of the climb. And only then did it creep in partially or subtly, too. And I remember walking up there and him telling me, oh, this is Tuckerman's Ravine, and people ski this in the winter. And I remember thinking to myself, how do you ski down this? You mean you fall and maybe the skis are touching the ground? I mean, it was so steep and so massive, yet very, very beautiful and scenic. And he shared his love of those things. of that view of God's world that so many of us never get to see from such a perspective. He had knowledges of plants and animals. He had extensive books on birds. And something simple like a cardinal coming into the yard, the house was alerted right away. He had bird feeders out. And if he saw something rare, he had a book that he could quickly refer to on that. He tried to share his love of being the Eagle Scout and knowledge that brought of nature, of people, of good deeds, of offering help and being prepared, and enrolled both my brother and I in Cub Scouts and graduating to Webelos. And I think my brother surpassed me in this area of sticking with it, even though he kind of loaded the deck and made my mother be a den mother, just so we couldn't quit. But this was important to him. And it was something that, again, he shared. My father was a pioneer in nerddom before it was cool to be a nerd. So nowadays they say it's cool not being cool. That was my dad, and he was the king of it. We mentioned about the plaid pants that he would rock on many occasions. But when my brother and I were young, how cool was it for us that this MIT graduate had comic books mailed directly to the house? And there was a pecking order when they arrived. Dad got them first. And I was the youngest, so I got them last, too. And this was before all of the comic book rage translated into movies and all these different aspects of entertainment and how the value of these comic books took off. He was reading them from a little kid. And again, something that he shared for us. And my brother and I are both sci-fi geeks to this day, thanks to the gifts that my father gave us. We would watch Doctor Who on PBS because he was very frugal with his money and wouldn't pay for cable. So PBS was often our go-to station of the three that we had. Doctor Who was a family event, too. Many of the nature channels on PBS, too, we enjoyed together as a family before bed every night. And I remember I always got more tired before Dave did, and I would throw him under the bus by saying, "I'm sleepy, what time is it?" Knowing full well that my dad right away would say, "Go to bed, kids." And sorry, Dave, I probably didn't pick up on that. But again, things that he shared that stayed with us that were quite unintentional on his part. He was just being who he was. He was interested in some of the aspects of the occult and tarot cards, not because he had any faith or belief in these things, but he found them intriguing and that they could suggest telling the future or predicting things about ourselves that we didn't know. And so he could put out tarot cards and give you information about what they say and how that applies to you, too. He was very much a love of his heritage and his Scottish roots. He studied very in-depth the clans of Scotland and his clan, too. And he always wanted to make sure we were very proud of where we came from. And he talked a lot about the palace intrigue, I guess you would call it, between clans and the conflicts and the betrayals and the victories and all things related to his background in the Scottish Highlands, which he visited with my mother on multiple occasions. And we had a family tree that would really spell out that heritage. And that love ran between both my mother and father of our heritage and of where we came from, too. And the family tree even traced its heritage back to Robert the Bruce. He was very proud of that. Come to find out, he was the bad guy in Braveheart by Mel Gibson, but that's okay because my father appreciated a good villain and how they carried themselves. And going back to comic books, his favorite villain was Dr. Doom. And I would ask him, "Why Dr. Doom, Dad?" And he'd say, well, obviously because he doesn't want to destroy the world, because what good is a destroyed world? You can't rule it that way. And so he always respected that about Dr. Doom. One thing that many people don't know about my father, too, is he was a big pro wrestling fan, which you wouldn't think, being a man of logic and rationale. And I think when dating myself, but back when my brother and I were young, there was still a debate on how real wrestling really was. And the majority, I think, people believed that it was not scripted at all. My father knew better. But when I brought this up to him, he looked at me and he said, are you telling me that one of those two guys at some point isn't going to get mad and start going off script? And I was like, you're probably right, Dad. And so that would be the match. We'd watch the match for when that would happen, when we could tell, all right, this probably isn't what they were planning to do, but it's entertaining as heck while you watch it, too. My father was frugal, as Laura mentioned, but he had a humor about it, too. And he had this joke where he would say, how was copper wire invented? How, Dad? 2 Scotsmen found the same penny. And that was my father, too. He was frugal, but he would be quick to poke fun of himself at that. He could take a joke. I remember being a kid where when we go to McDonald's, he would buy us a large fry for me and my brother to split because it was a couple of cents cheaper than getting 2 individual small fries, even though that would probably avoid a lot of conflict between my brother and I having to share a large fry. So most of our trips to McDonald's degenerated into how quickly you can finish that large fry between 2 brothers. And it probably would have made his life a lot easier just to give us a small fry, but those couple of cents, though, it wouldn't be good to just give those to McDonald's. He was a terrible teacher. I remember him trying to teach me math, and he would get frustrated. It was like, why can't you understand this? It's so simple. And I learned early on to stay quiet, play ignorant. He'd get frustrated and go away eventually. And it worked. But it goes to show you, great players don't always make great coaches. About my siblings a little bit, my perceptions of their relations, and they may tell you differently. I always felt Dave and my father shared a bond through being builders and being engineers. And my brother mentioned he did indeed follow in his footsteps. And a family that was full of teachers, surrounded by them. Well, my father's father was actually a builder himself. And then my dad went on to become an engineer. And I know he was really proud of Dave for following him along in his career path, too. And I got to see the relationship between them firsthand when I'd come back from college, and he got me a job working in the same chemical plant where him and Dave were working. And I didn't work too much side by side with my father, but I definitely had an opportunity for my brother. He took me under his wings and showed me what to do. They both shared a very good and close bond. And the interesting thing is neither one of them seemed too aware of it. It was just the way things were. And we all know how Laura changed him when she came around. Dad goes soft all of a sudden. And my brother and I scratching our heads looking at each other. How the heck does she get away with this when son of... And I think it was a big evolution in my dad's life, the introduction of Laura. Anytime a man's heart, who's sometimes can be hard, can soften in such a way, is indeed telling of the man. Recognizing, evolving, loving in a new and different way. He cared for others immensely. If someone needed help, he would be the first to go. A lot of times, growing up as children, he would not offer us help. He would wait for us. He would give us a chance to do things on our own. And if we needed him, he was there. He was always there. I had forgotten that at times. That he was always there. And then the dementia came. It was almost 7 years to the day, given a week or two that we buried my mother, and I stood up here talking about her, and it grieves me so much to be here now. The evening of the wake of my mother, which 7 years ago today would have been last night, and then I went back to the family home in North Reading, and we sat, and we talked, and we ate pizza from Captain's Pizza, and we drank peaty scotch. And peaty just is a word for a smoky flavor. Scotch that he went to Scotland and brought back. And it's a very fond memory I still have. And that night, I wrote the words that I would speak the following morning up here about my mother. I spoke a lot about my mother's grandchildren, and now obviously my father's grandchildren. I talked about our spouses and about the family. And I hope I can get to that in a moment. But if I could just get back to the dementia aspect of things. That night, eating pizza and sipping peaty scotch, I saw some of it from him. Just every now and then, a slip-up. Something that didn't quite gel. And his state started being revealed to us. It wasn't long after that where he couldn't remember my name. And I would say to him, "Dad, my name is Jamie. What's my name?" And there was a point he stopped even being able to echo back, "Jamie," to me. But Laura said it. He was there, completely and totally. He was a man that was removed of the knowledge of what's around him, where he came from, where he had been, of the happenings of going around. In the moment, which was always for my father, he lived there. There was what was right in front of him. And what was right in front of him didn't prevent him from being who he was. And Laura gave the example of the joke. Wouldn't want to embarrass you, kid. I have another example of that too, which just recently I got to spend some time with my father at Brooksby, and I would visit him, and I remember we were watching Harry Potter movie was on, and there was this character that appeared, and it was clearly a CGI animation of some sort into the film. And I remember him looking at that and studying it and wondering how that was possible. That he didn't think the creature was real by any means, but he wondered, how? How was that creature on that screen with live actors, but that creature wasn't real? And I could see him pondering it. And then so I read on his face, and I would say, "Dad, it's computer-generated graphics superimposed onto the screen." And he would hear me, but he was lost in that scientific mind of analyzing what he was seeing in that moment. And so I'd like to suggest that my father never left. His soul was just exposed because there was none of this extraneous past, present, future around him. What we saw was his soul, and God chose to not leave any more room for things to be carved on there. It was full. Everything was already engraved on his soul, and it was exposed for all to see. There was no changing of that on what happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow. There was none of the influences that guide us in our own development throughout our lives, because we are ever changing. We are ever growing. We are always seeking something, even if sometimes we don't know what that is. And for my father, that journey ended, and he was who he was. And there was nothing to hide that from anyone. And he shared that. And even without the dementia, it would have been without shame or embarrassment of our own shortcomings that we all have. So my relationship with my father, I came across this quote from Mark Twain. You're probably familiar with it. And I heard it, and I thought to myself, Mark Twain could be onto something there. It reads, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in just 7 years." I think that kind of sums up the way I was. I was difficult for him, I think, because he couldn't see how much he influenced me. I couldn't see how much he influenced me. And here we are, and I'm still learning how much he influenced me. And as difficult as this is right now, I walk away with a better knowledge of myself. And again, I thank him for that. I didn't follow his career path. I went on to follow the teacher route, like so many people in the family. I didn't have Laura's ability to soften his heart, even though I tried as hard as I could be to be as cute as I could be all the time. My values as a teen were superficial. They were non-tangible, even rebellious at times. Such isn't the behavior for someone that needs to prepare for the future. But he did influence me. I went on and I joined high school wrestling, which I come to find out there were no ropes or turnbuckles or chairs waiting nearby. It was a very different sport. But because of him, I stuck with it through college. My love of science fiction, a strong sense, I hope I have a strong sense of right and a belief of duty, civic and otherwise. My father knew his gifts, but he also felt it was important to share that with others, to better humanity in some way. And even with my aunt's passing, one thing that always stood out about his sister was her sense of duty, her sense of right. It was important to her, and it was important to my father. It was ingrained in their family from their father, and it was ingrained on us and hopefully on our children moving forward too. We have shared that with them. Ask me my memories of my father, and there's a lot I could reply as. But right now, standing before you, it would be pizza and peaty scotch, and that night. We miss you already, Dad. But the death of my father marks a change in our family. Maybe I could put it in a way that he might find amusing. The Marshall clan, ever-changing and developing. With the passing of my aunt and my father, the next generation is here now. And King David would be proud. He has 8 strong and healthy grandsons and granddaughters that will take up the fight, assuming that we guide them. He's given us the tools to guide them, both materially and spiritually. We need to share those with our children so they can share them with theirs. Our sons and daughters will live up to the Marshall name, and my sister's children will live up to the Beaulieu name. And they are our allies to the north, King David, in the fair kingdom of New Hampshire. They stand ready to help us. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Queen Betty's allies out to the west, the Barfields, that she loved so dearly, and that my sister has made sure that they have come along and remain our allies. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today and allowing me to share with you what I've just spoken. I'm a better person than I was yesterday. Because of my father, I'll try to be a better person tomorrow.
The memories that are good also make it hard to say goodbye, which is why we come this day to walk with our God, whose love is from everlasting to everlasting. Long ago, the psalmist put his trust in God and wrote words that still speak to our hearts today. So I invite you now to join me in saying again the words to the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell forever in the house of the Lord.
We have gathered today in the presence of our God of the past, who blesses us with memories that are good. We've gathered in the presence of our God of today, who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death. And most of all, we have gathered in the presence of our God of tomorrow, who has promised us a life that shall be everlasting. Jesus said, "Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go and prepare a place for you? And when I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. I will not leave you desolate. I will come to you. Yet a little while, and the world will see me no more, but you will see me. Because I live, you will live also. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." What all of this means, good people, is that there are two ways to grieve. One is with despair, and the other is with hope. Because we have this promise of a life that shall be everlasting, we grieve with hope, which is why I always point out that I wear a stole that is white and not black, the traditional color of mourning. It is white because we grieve with hope. And the essence of our faith is that while we cannot bring back those we love, we shall one day, through the grace of God, be with them. Please join me in the responsive call to prayer. In the rising of the sun and its fading, in the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, in the opening of buds and the rebirth of spring, in the blueness of the sky and the warmth of summer, in the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of autumn, when we are weary and in need of strength, in the beginning of the year and when it ends, when we are lost and heartsick, When we have joys we yearn to share, so long as we live, they shall be in our hearts. Let us pray. Eternal God, behind the sacred mystery of life and death and everlasting life, there is the beating of your glorious love. So we will not mourn as those who have no hope. We will not lose heart even though sorrow and loneliness weave their shadows around us. For we know that even though our brother David has departed out of this world, he is not beyond the reach of your everlasting arms. Bless him now with the fullness and wholeness of the life that shall be lived out forever in your loving presence. In the knowledge that it is not your will that the least of your children should perish, we entrust David to your tender care. Take the love that is here today and add it to your own, that he may be forever richly blessed. Merciful God, in whom we live and move and have our being, embrace your servants who have gathered here this day. Support us all the day long until the evening comes. The busy world is hushed. The fever of life is over and our work is done. Then, in your great goodness, reunite us in a holy and everlasting rest with those who have gone before. We ask it in the name of our risen Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. As we prepare to depart, let us join in singing the great hymn of promise, Amazing Grace. I invite you to stand as you are able. Please be seated. And now may the love of God, which passes all understanding, abide with you and within you. May it comfort you, uphold you, and guide you today and for all the days that are yet to be. Amen.